Well, hey, welcome back to the Applied Leadership Podcast. My name is Brandon, as always, joined by my good friend and partner, Blaine Smith. And we are here today to do another special episode specifically for the Colorado Fire Leadership Series. Now, typically, what we do in the Applied Leadership Podcast is that we take on one question, and we usually talk about that one question for about a half an hour. This time, we had a wonderful session with leaders across the state of Colorado, representing various different fire districts. I think we had somewhere close to about 200 people on the call. We had watch parties. It was a real blast. These folks are amazing. And in the end, we had so many questions. I think after about 45 minutes of questions, we still had some strap hanging questions. So we're going to address those. And just to provide a little bit of context, the discussion that we had this time, the module, was one about foundations of leadership. And foundations of leadership is really our way to launch into the discussion about leadership and taking it very seriously. We do a canvas of about 150 years of leadership theory, things that go from the path goal theory or situational leadership theory, servant leadership theory, trait-based leadership theory, authentic. We go through a lot of those and just kind of talk about some of those things, because what we often find is that what we are doing out there in our leadership practice, many times we don't really know that it's actually been informed by a lot of really deep research, a lot of really smart people who really care a lot about the practice and the art of leadership and have given us a lot to hold on to. So we canvass that. And then we also talk about leadership and management. We find it is quite common that two things come up. Either folks use leadership and management as if they are interchangeable words, or they pit them against one another as if one might be better than the other. You often hear these things that sound something like, well, I'm a leader, I'm not a manager. And the general principle or thought that we want to bring into the discussion is that leadership and management are two separate things. They both have merit. They are both of equal value. And it is really incumbent upon us in leadership positions to figure out how the two of them can come best into fruition for effectiveness. So with management, you see it produces order, it produces consistency. You have things like planning and budgeting, organizing, staffing, controlling, problem solving. With leadership, it's a little bit more about the what produces change and movement. It's establishing direction, it's aligning people, it's motivating and inspiring folks. And so just in saying those words, you can see that both of them are critical in our practice of leadership in this day and age. So we've got a couple of questions to clean up. Let's jump into it. The first question is a wonderful question. So what are typical challenges that arise for servant leaders?
It's a really good question. I think this is fairly common in this day and age. I believe a lot of folks, including ourselves, like to think of ourselves as servant leaders, and it is not without its pitfalls. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is we really have to consistently check in with ourselves on whom it is that we intend to serve at any given time. Because I think the pitfall would be you've got a person on your team or something that has arisen that you've got to deal with, and you don't want to let anybody down. You know, maybe the person that's having challenges or the person that had the idea that's not working out is someone you care about. You consider yourself a servant leader, and so you are very loyal to them, and you want to make sure you're taking good care of them, and you feel a big sense of responsibility. And all of that is fine and totally understandable, and that's what we're looking for in servant leadership. But what we have to be very careful about is if that person's best interest or if that project or that decision starts to become harmful to the greater team, or, you know, God forbid it becomes harmful to the whole mission, then you can start to have to make some decisions here. So me as a servant leader, I don't want to let this person down. I don't want to let them drop. I want to take care of them. I certainly don't want to let them go or cut them loose. But it might be that their participation, their decision-making, their performance is now starting to harm a bigger audience of people. And it's important in those moments, I think, to take a step back and just say, yes, I am a servant leader, but I have to remind myself whom it is I am serving. And ultimately, we'd like to think it is the mission. It's the end user, the customer, however you want to define that. Working back from there, it might be your company or your organization. Drawing the circles a little bit tighter, it might be your team or the department that you work in. And yes, we want to be loyal to caring for and serve each individual person, but we cannot let our desire to take great care of one person or our reticence to let one person down overshadow the overarching mission that we are on. So for me, I think that's the biggest pitfall. And my recommendation would be sometimes we got to think a little bit bigger and make sure that we're not trying so hard to serve one person that we fail to serve the whole.
Yeah, I really like that a lot. I think the words that popped into my mind as I was listening to you, Blaine, is that servant leadership is not doormat leadership. And I think certainly we need to be careful about that, right? It can feel like that sometimes if you feel, and I think this is a pitfall, is we often talk about the race to 51%, that we want to be willing to cover more than half the ground to meet somebody in the middle. We want to be the type of business and the type of people that delivers 51% of the value to any relationship. I think that's very thematic of the heart of servant leadership. And I think what we need to be careful of, though, is that we don't overextend ourselves so much that it feels like we're doormats or it feels like we get taken advantage of, because sometimes that happens. And I love how you are thinking about who are we serving, because it reminds us as leaders that we're often serving more than one of our teammates. We have a team, whether that team have however many people on it, if it's more than one person on it, we also have to be considerate about that. We have to be considerate about the other people that are on the team. And we have to be considerate of what that end user, as you so rightly have pointed out, the customer is experiencing on the end of that. And so I think we say that because we have experienced a number of situations as frontline leaders ourselves. We've experienced these situations as leaders of leaders. We've seen countless of these situations come up with some of our partners where I've even heard the term reverse delegation come up recently with one of our leaders that we have been talking with and coaching, because the concept, that she had brought to us was that, what do I do with this? Because I've delegated something to somebody and I'm trying to be a servant leader and they've asked me to take it back because I'm better at it, quote unquote. And I would just bring about the other thing that I'd like to add to this is that I think with a pitfall that we need to be aware of is that oftentimes as leaders, we provide what people need, not what they want. And I think that we need to be willing to compare what somebody wants versus what they need. Now, you may want to give something back because you think that, the leader's better at it or for whatever reason, right? I'm assuming the best intention in anybody here. Like I'm not assuming malintent in anybody. So let's assume that somebody that you are serving as their leader wants to give something back because they feel that you have a higher proficiency in it, a certain level of excellence. That's understandable. Oftentimes in a leadership role, we need to give them the opportunity to learn how to do it, to rise to the occasion so that they can be less dependent upon us and they can be more free to execute the task that gets to the mission that ultimately serves that end user. So that's how I would kind of add on to it. I think those are some pitfalls that I would add that we need to be sensitive to.
Yeah, that's a really good one. So the upshot here is remember who you're serving and remember that it's still your job to lead. Servant leaders out there, stay with it. We know it's not easy. All right, Next question here. How do you stay consistent with a staff while meeting each individual's needs and leading them in a way that they best respond to? So I think the heart of this question, Brandon, is you don't want to lead everybody the same. And we've covered that ad nauseum in the past, but you also want there to be some level of consistency across the entire group of people that you're leading. And you don't just want to have to be switching styles all the time. So how do you think about that? How do we deliver some level of consistency to a team or a group of people that we're responsible for leading, while also appreciating and sometimes adjusting to the nuances of individuals and how they best respond?
Yeah, this is a really good question and candidly a really hard one to answer. And I'm going to start by saying nuance is the launch off point with how I would answer this question. I think nuance allows room for both consistency and flexibility. So, freedom within a framework, if you want to call it that. I think what does not change is the objective. What is it that we're trying to achieve? Whatever that mission is, whatever that end state is, whether it's your end state is we are on the front lines of the safety of our community, whether that be through fire service or emergency medical response, that cannot change. Whether that be you are a sales representative that is trying to achieve a goal, whether it be that you're on the laboratory end of a research division and you're trying to do good science, whatever the mission is, the mission doesn't change. And everybody needs to be able to align to that. We often talk about alignment being a harmony of effort. Effort towards that same direction does not always mean necessarily agreement. So this is where some of that nuance and flexibility starts to come in, where we would say agreement is a harmony of opinion. Now, opinions may vary, styles may vary, as long as it doesn't violate a standard. Maybe there's a protocol in place that keeps people safe, or maybe there's a paradigm or a protocol in place that keeps us within the scope of our legal limitations as a practice or as a mission, whatever that may be. That's the frame that we're operating within. But certain people have different ways to get to that end state, to get to that objective. And this is where I think as leaders, we can be willing to speak to people in different ways. Some people might respond a little bit better to that servant leadership type approach, where we can have those conversations and say to them, help me understand, like, where you at? Like, what do you feel you need to best flourish in this role right here? This is your role. This is how you fit within the larger scope of the organization, of the team, to meet that goal. But I would like to know how you respond best to things like feedback, to things like recognition, to things like what is your personal passion as to why you're here doing this job. I think those are some ideas of servant leadership, and that it wouldn't really conflict with someone on the same team who feels like they're super aligned. They don't really need to get into any of the big personal whys as to what brought them to this specific team and this specific mission, but maybe they're up against a very difficult obstacle in the midst of their practice, and that would be a good application of kind of a path goal approach. And I say path goal as in a theory because it is actually a theory that was developed in the 70s and whatnot, but it doesn't have to be so rigid or hard. All I'm saying is this is path goal theory. What are the obstacles that are preventing you from achieving your objective? Can we lay those out? Let's figure out what dynamics are at play here. Now, let me as the leader see how I can help you remove those obstacles so that you can get where you're trying to go. Either way, alignment stays the same. And it's just a recognition that people's different dispositions, their personalities, their experiences, their values, the way that they have come up through the world might necessitate us being willing to flex just a little bit so that they can hear the message that helps them to align to our overall mission.
Yeah, I think that mostly covers it. A couple of things jumped into my head there while you were talking. One is, I think this is a great place to employ authentic leadership, which is one of the theories that we talk about. And I think that if you are consistently showing up as who you are, eventually your team will understand how you communicate, how you lead, how you impart directions, and they'll adjust to getting the bulk of what it is that you have to convey. I would say that on the management side of the house, which I'm sure we'll get into more later, you can very consistently use, whatever your most comfortable leadership style is to convey most of the things that you need to get across and to be an effective manager in that way across the board with all your people, because they will get used to understanding how you share information, how you impart direction, etc. I would say when it comes to doing some real leadership tasks, that's where you might want to be a little more nuanced and individualized in your approach. And I would define that as when everything is working generally as it should work, when the system is operating as according to plan, when we're going through day-to-day kind of routine things, you can probably be a bit more consistent and a bit more uniform. If a problem arises, an emergency pops up, something breaks, someone has a really, really bad day, when something happens that didn't go according to plan, that's where you really, as a leader, need to step in and maybe understand their individual needs or take an approach that might be a bit more specific to that person and their personality and how they kind of see the world. So I wouldn't stress it too much. Yes, you need to be willing to be flexible. Yes, you need to understand your people and try to meet them where they're at. I would say for 80, maybe 90% of what you're doing as a leader, as long as you're communicating clearly, you're communicating consistently, you're showing up authentically as who you are day after day after day, people will get that. They'll recognize it. They'll find comfort in that. And they'll be able to get almost all of what it is you're putting down, and they'll be able to execute. And when things go awry, when something happens that wasn't according to plan, when things break down, or when we need to start from scratch and do something new, then you can think a little bit more nuanced in how you want to communicate with each individual person.
Yeah, Blaine, you mentioned something here that I think is so important that I'd kind of like to underline it. And it is this. The word consistency came up in your remarks a couple times. It was actually in the question here. And I just want to note that a real pitfall of this is when leaders begin to make unfair concessions to different personnel on the team that deviate from widely accepted standards or practices and puts others in a position that feel that this is unequitable. A perfect example, if there is a certain scheduling standard, so this again falls within kind of that management paradigm, right? You think about organizing, staffing, scheduling. If there's a certain scheduling standard and there are people who are receiving benefits that others are not receiving based under that paradigm without good reason or without, a clear understanding as to why, that can tend to start to bring bad feelings about within the organization, because then people just feel like, well, gosh, this is just a place where special favors are done. And I guess I'm just not one of the special people that gets special favors. And then drama starts to go and all the backbiting and the gossiping and whatnot. But I think that's a real pitfall here is remain consistent. And I would be remiss if I don't give you the opportunity to also sound off on the importance of being willing to make exceptions to policies when they make sense and how you do that.
Yeah, I think the heart of my response is really that you need to keep showing up as who you are as a leader. And it would be a mistake, I think, to try to be shifting your leadership style all the time so that you're individually meeting every single person all the time. At some point, you need to be who you are and show up consistently, be that person and do your very best. Give people that consistency and that understanding. They can see what's coming and they'll adapt and be fine. And within that, you can exercise good judgment and discernment to occasionally make an exception to a policy that makes sense, whether it's for an individual person or more broadly. You and I have talked about this for many years now, and I think we both believe that an organization and a leader cannot, by definition, be exceptional if they refuse to ever make an exception, right? I think that's the business of leaders, is to look at a situation and not just to follow some spreadsheet algorithm flow chart for every single thing. You can't manage your way out of leadership at times. And so if you're consistent, if you are who you are, if people know what to expect from you, and from time to time, you need to make an exception either to accommodate somebody or to seize an opportunity that just became available or to adjust to something that was totally off script. It's okay to do that. And you can afford to do that if you've been showing up consistently for a long time. People will note that as an exception and not now as a changed policy.
Yeah. So good. I'm so glad that you said what I thought you were going to say, because I've heard you say it a number of times and it's so good. It's so good.
I'm glad I didn't let you down.
Yeah, never do. All right, let's move on. I think this actually ties really well into the last question. How do you determine what is a failure of leadership versus a failure of management?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we've already kind of teed this up a little bit. Very quickly, we would describe management as all of the tasks, all of the processes, all of the functions and activities that need to happen for an organization to function as it is designed and intended to function. And that's a lot of things, and it requires some skill and it requires some practice. So as you mentioned, it might be staffing, organizing, planning, etc. Those things have to happen. They have to happen consistently, and somebody needs to make sure to do a good job in designing and adhering to those kinds of practices. I think loosely we would define leadership as the things that happen outside of that. So it's maybe we don't know what we need to do yet, and we need to come up with a strategy. Maybe we need to cast a vision. Maybe something has changed rapidly in the space and we have to figure out the appropriate way to pivot or make an adjustment. Maybe we have, conflict with our personnel and we've got to deconflict that and make sure we have harmony. Those are leadership tasks. And so that's how I would start answering this question, is determine where the breakdown is. Take a look at what happened, try to take a breath, ask some questions if you need to, take a moment to look closely at where the breakdown is. And then you can determine, is this a breakdown of a management task? Like, are we just not doing a very good job of quality control? Is this a scheduling issue? Something along those lines? Or do we have a good process, a good procedure, a good system in place, and we're just not executing against a quality plan? Then it might be a breakdown in leadership. And this is really important, by the way, and we talk to teams all the time about, even if you think a plan or a strategy or something like that is not as good as you think it should be, it's really critical that everybody gets in line and executes it to the very best of their ability. Because when that happens, only two things can happen, and they're both pretty good. One is it works, right? So we come up with a plan or an approach or a strategy. We all execute to the best of our ability and it works. That's great. That's obviously what we're going for. The other thing that can happen, however, is that it doesn't work. But in that case, it's still an okay outcome because we've learned something, right? We had a plan, we executed to the very best of our ability, and it didn't work. Now we can say, hey, that's probably a management issue. Like, it just wasn't a good plan, so let's make a better plan. Versus, we didn't really believe in it. We didn't really execute it. Maybe some people were half-stepping it and it didn't work. Well, now we don't know anything. We haven't learned anything because we don't know whether it was our effort and our execution that caused it not to work, or whether it just wasn't a very good plan in the first place, and we're left having to pick up the pieces and start fresh, but we don't really know where to go. And so I think that is a critical thing to point out here, is that it's okay to have systems and processes and procedures that we execute to the very best of our ability, because then we can learn and we can grow. If we have a failure of leadership, that's the lack of inspiring, motivating, and getting people to line up harmoniously to execute that plan. And so take a step back, think about where the breakdown was, and you might be able to isolate the variable in that case.
I have nothing to add to that. Spot on.
Dude, okay. Let's move it right along here. We got more questions to get to, so let's not belabor the point.
I know.
All right. Next question is, I'm curious about your take on a leader who consistently says, "because I said so," and how you might deal with that. So, whether you're a parent, a manager, a leader, we've all been in this space before. And look, just to put my cards on the table, there are plenty of times when I want to say, "Hey, just because I said so." And you and I speak a lot in our trust module. I think we've spoken about it a lot lately, in fact, about how there are some leaders right now who justifiably are just wanting their people to execute. Like, please, can you just execute and get something done? Because I'm becoming exhausted having to kind of delineate every single point and litigate every one of my decisions. I'm doing my best here, and I just would love you to execute for a little while and see if it works. So it sounded kind of a funny sounding question. And I think it would be very easy to dismiss any leader who says, "because I said so." I think you and I have been looking at this enough lately to know, yeah, we don't really recommend that approach, but we can empathize with leaders who are in a space right now who are like, could you just do the thing? I mean, come on, let's go.
Yeah. I so much. I mean, we have spent a lot of time thinking about this, writing about this, talking about this, particularly in our trust module with many organizations right now, because there is this dynamic that is occurring where a lot of folks, I would almost call it, it's like leadership in the age of cynicism. There's a lot of cynicism out there right now. We talk about this all the time, particularly as it was relating to the authentic leadership model, which has really emerged in the 2000s, because let's be honest, the 2000s have been a bad look for institutions. It's been a bad look for organizations. Like we came into the turn of the century with Enron scandals, and you have the Silicon Valley Bank stuff, and you've got the 9/11, there's COVID. I could go on.
Very low trust in large institutions.
Very low
right
trust. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There's very low trust in large institutions right now. That is just a matter of fact. And leading in an age where there is low trust and high cynicism is difficult. And so I like the fact that we're talking a little bit about the leader side of things, because as you have correctly stated, some leaders that we talk to are just fatigued. They're just tired of having to litigate every single thing that should not have to be litigated, or over explaining things. And I think in the end of the day are looking for a little bit of trust. Now, because I said so leadership, where's that coming from, right? So, we started this as a exploration of all these theoretical frameworks and whatnot. Basically, what that is coming out of is a legitimate power base, right? A legitimate authority base. So, and when I say that, I'm referring to the 1959, 1960s through 70s French and Raven sociological models, or scientific models of leadership that talk about reward, coercion, legitimate, expert, and referent power bases, right? So a leader has the ability to pull on a legitimate power base and say, hey, it's your job. I said to do it. Now, would we encourage people to lead from that posture? No. As a general approach, maybe consider some of these other ways of understanding people. You talk about reward as a basis of power or influence, whichever you want to call it, if you want to soften the word power a little bit, of influence and leadership. I don't view that as a negative influence base, because the truth is that we all put on our pants in the morning and we go to work, whatever work that we do, and we do expect certain value exchange to come from that labor, whether it's an intrinsic pull that you are looking for a place to serve and you find yourself in the first responder community prospectively, or in uniform in the military, whether it's that you work for a medical diagnostics company and your mission, like it is within your DNA and your heartbeat. I've said this often before, like it made sense to me to go work in the cancer diagnostic space because we lost my mother-in-law to cancer. I cared very much. I wanted to be a part of the solution. Maybe it's that you're a sales professional and you just love crushing your number and making a crap load of money. Whatever. Like, I'm not here to judge anybody's motivation. Your motives are your motives, And so I would say, think about some of those other ways that people show up to contribute their time and their talent. Think about what the value exchange is involved there. And Blaine, we've talked a lot to this about with social impact organizations. Don't think for a second that people that volunteer their time aren't getting something out of it. They are. They get something out of it. It's not just the application of charitable interest. It's also maybe they really wanted to find a way to serve. Maybe it makes them feel their most altruistic, fullest self, whatever. The point is that if we can find other ways to maybe influence people, we would encourage that as a jump off point. And, sometimes there is an appropriate opportunity to flex a little bit of that legitimate authority. Blaine, you actually made a really important observation about this as it related to our time leading in the special operations community, where we are often put into very asymmetrical environments, very complicated, complex situations. It's often murky and gray, and you have to do things and figure things out. And in these settings, you often want the team to be giving you the best insights, the best information, their perspectives on how we can tackle very big problems. And then sometimes you take fire, and we don't need to have a discussion when we say take cover and 12 o'clock, 300 meters, whatever the target is. Like, that's not time for discussion. That's the time for, we actually need to react to contact and actually eliminate the threat right now.
Yeah, I think all of that is spot on. And I'll take the other side of it here quickly to try to answer the question of how do you deal with that if you're on the receiving end. And my only recommendation would be take a step back and try to understand where this leader is coming from. And if you think they're using because I said so too often, or at times when it's not appropriate, think about ways that you can provide, constructive and professional feedback. And so if you're in a situation and you have a legitimate question like, hey, why are we doing it this way? And the response is because I said so, you may be justifiably dissatisfied with that response. And so maybe the next time before you go talk to that leader and you want to say, hey, why are we doing it this way? Come with sort of issue recommendation or issue discussion recommendation and say, hey, I've noticed we're doing this way, and I feel like there might be a more efficient way of doing this, or I wonder if maybe there's a better way of doing this, or I've looked at this and I've had a few challenges with it, and I wanted to let you know that, because you might be able to bring something to the leader who is perhaps overwhelmed. Maybe the reason they're saying because I said so is they just feel a bit overwhelmed, or they're crazy busy. And if you can provide something of value to them, like a critical insight or an observation or some ground truth from the field, they may actually value that. I can't speak to every single case, but I would suggest that if I was a leader and I was a bit overwhelmed or crazy busy, and I started using the because I said so or some version of that too often, I would appreciate someone bringing me a more complete argument and saying, hey, I know that you want it done this way, but the last 3 times we did it, we had double as many complaints and this or that happened. And I want you to have that information so that we can make an adjustment if you feel like it's appropriate. Any way that you can be patient, communicate professionally, provide something that's of value to the broader situation, you're definitely more likely to get a positive response from the leader. Again, I can't guarantee that you will, but maybe the move is just to try to give the leader some grace, assume that they're operating with best intent, provide them, with a level of clarity and concision, some recommendations, and then see if that doesn't move the needle for you. And hopefully it will.
So our next question, as someone who is newer to leadership, would you recommend trying different leadership styles to see what works for me and my team? I love that question.
Yeah, great question, and an honest one. I appreciate that. I have a couple thoughts off the top of my head. I would say everything that we try to provide for folks is kind of this 3-part process that loops back on itself, and it's awareness, application, and reflection. And so if you're new to leadership, I would encourage you to keep that framework in mind. Awareness being you're now aware of some various leadership styles and theories. So you have some knowledge of how this stuff works. So that's great. You've done the work to educate yourself. You're aware. Try some things out. Absolutely. Put it into application, and maybe pick a leadership style or a leadership theory that you feel like you connect most with, that resonates with you. That's probably the place to start. And give that a shot and work on it for a while, put it into play. That's the application part. And then pay attention. Maybe it's get some direct feedback from someone you trust. Maybe it's just kind of pay attention to how people are responding. That's the reflection portion. And then based upon that, you can kind of loop back to the beginning. That increases your awareness. And then you can revise your application if you need to, and just kind of continue that in a virtuous cycle. So, awareness, application, reflection is really important, especially if you're new to leadership. And I would say definitely start with whatever leadership style just feels the most resonant with you and most aligned with your disposition and your personality. There are some tools you can use that can help you with that. I think Standout 2.0 is a good one. It's a newer one that I think works fairly well. There's a million other ones. So if you feel like you maybe want to use a tool to help you kind of identify where your strengths are or where your natural disposition lies, I think that's okay to do that. I would caution against getting sort of analysis paralysis and going too deep into that, because you can just kind of make it too there's just too many inputs and you can't sort it out. So find 1 or 2 maybe, use those, start trying to apply it and go from there. So overall, my answer would be, yeah, try some stuff out. I would just also, be a little cautious about being a chameleon and trying all these things out in a way that feels a little bit robotic. Like, take the first step in awareness is figuring out kind of who you are and where you fall in some of these things. Use that as a solid starting point, and then give it some application, do some reflection, continue to refine. And I think before long you'll find your groove and you'll be fine.
So yeah, I love how you are thinking about this, Blaine, and I would just add a couple of things as you are becoming aware and you're applying and you're reflecting is give yourself a little bit of grace. I mean, leadership is hard, especially if you care. That's a good thing. It's a good thing that you're already aware of some of these things enough to ask the question. I think you're already off to a great start. One of the values of a Foundations of Leadership module with us is that we're just giving you some perspective, some frameworks to look at, some handholds so that you don't feel like you're climbing without any supports out there, because there are supports out there. And the other thing that I would just say is that don't be afraid to share with the people that you're leading how you actually feel about this. Hey, I'm a little new to leadership and I really care. I really want to do a great job. I'm attending this course. It's really cool. Here are some of the things that I learned. Show them the different theories. Show them, like, what do you think about this? I'm curious to hear what you think about it. I love the call out of a Standout 2.0 as well. I'm a big fan of Standout 2.0 to help you, again, get a little bit of awareness, get some of those handholds so that you can do some of those climbs as a leader with at least some understanding of maybe this is something that aligns really well with me, and use that as a jump off point and just be willing to give yourself some grace as you navigate the process of sharpening your leadership axe. That's what we're doing every single day. We haven't made it, and we never want to feel like we made it, because leadership is all about practice and reflection and refinement and practicing again. And that is the beauty of leadership and why we feel so excited to be able to do this work every day.
Yep, absolutely. Just like parenting, you never arrive. You just try to do your best, and the situation changes, and stay flexible, be willing to be a student. I don't think anyone's ever going to fault you for trying to be better at being a leader. So don't apologize for that. I think we got one more question here, Brandon, and it is, maybe straightforward. We'll see what you have to say about this. It's, what are your thoughts on effective span of control as it relates to leadership? And I know this is something that the Army is very serious about. So what do you think, Brandon? Effective span of control?
Yes, the Army is very serious about this. If my numbers are misquoted, I apologize, but I believe it's somewhere between 3 to 5 is the effective span of control for the Army. So what that means is that the Army would consistently tell us that if you are in charge of more than 3 to 5 direct reports at any given time, it's probably too much. And so you're probably being pulled in too many directions, which gives you inability to focus. It's very challenging to lead a small team, even if it's a small organization or a large and complex organization, when you start to get further and further and further away from the mission, quote unquote, or the action, the heat. And so I think that's a good base to flex from. I have, in the last 25 years, ever since learning that back when I was knee high to a private, as we would say, I've kept that in frame. I've kept that in scope, whether it was being a leader of a pretty large and complex organization when we were at the Tennyson Center, or whether we were at Team Red, White, and Blue. I think we always try to keep that in mind and conscious, because at its core, if you are so fractured in focus, it's really hard to give people what they deserve and what they need in leadership. And so I would just use that as an initial jump off point to flex from in terms of a quote unquote number. But the point is more important, which is consider how far. It's kind of like when you're doing advanced rifle marksmanship, right? When you're doing advanced rifle marksmanship, you can move or shoot only as fast or as well as your shot group tells you that you can go. So what I'm saying is that if you're going too fast, you see your shot group start to expand. It gets really wide. It's scattered. It's sloppy. you're going too fast. You got to tighten it up. I would take that illustration and relate it to this idea of span of control. If it's getting so sloppy because you're so wide, because you're leading so many people and you're trying to give your attention to so many different people who are doing so many different things, it's probably time to tighten up your shot group and tighten up that span of control. Maybe you need to reduce it to an effective amount of people that you can effectively engage with, and you can not feel so fractured so that the mission is as tight as possible and not so sloppy.
Yep. 3 to 5 is the number. And I'll just add a little bit of color to this, which I think as you get higher and higher up as a leader within an organization, that 3 to 5 can really represent the number of subordinate elements that you're directly in charge of. You may end up having more than 3 to 5 direct reports, on the org chart, but you should not be responsible for more than 3 to 5 subordinate elements within your organization. So when you're a young, E4 or buck sergeant, you become a team leader. You have 3 people you're in charge of in a team of 4. That's it. You have 3 people. When you become a squad leader, you have 2 fire teams, each consisting of 4 people. The platoon leader has 4 squads. The company commander has 3 to 4 platoons. So there might be other people on the staff, the executive officer, the first sergeant. There may be other people that report to the company commander, but he or she is still only really in charge of 3 to 4 subordinate elements, ideally with people you fully trust, have trained, and are very capable to command and be responsible for those. And the same applies in corporate America or in the fire service or anywhere else you go. You may have a bigger team of people that are doing things, but if you have more than 3 to 5 subordinate elements, departments, divisions, etc., that you're responsible for, you will start to get frayed and fractured in the way that Brandon described, and that's not ideal. And we do see this. We see sometimes where we've lost a key person because they've moved on or whatever, and now we've got the COO or somebody who's got 7 or 8 departments all reporting up to him or her. And in almost every case, even our most capable people start to really struggle. Or those departments, you'll see some of them that are not getting the kind of care and attention that they need and deserve in order to thrive, because the COO is in charge of everything from HR to marketing to business development, and it's just not going to work. So 3 to 5 is the number. If you can keep your number of direct reports to that, that's ideal. As you become a more senior leader and you're a little bit more capable, a little bit more experienced, you still want to keep the number of entities you're in charge of to 3 to 5. And for goodness sakes, find smart, capable people and empower them to lead those subordinate organizations, because they'll do a better job than you can. And you can do the job that you've been assigned to do at whatever level that is.
Yeah, I so appreciate that call out that you're making about elements, because we work with a lot of organizations who have the C-suite, and the C-suite might include, let's call it 5 to 10 people or 5 to 8 people who are really, in truth, reporting to the chief executive officer of the organization. But if you look really closely, what you're going to find is that most of the time, those represent essentially 3 to 5 functional elements of a business. And you often have that staff that's been assembled because there are key facilitators or enablers in it, such as a general counsel or a compliance officer, people of those nature who, and those might be 2 of the same people, who are at least able to advise that senior leader on those 3 to 5 elements that are functioning, because it's so critical to the core business. So I so appreciate you pulling that number out of just a kind of a black and white. It's got to be no more than 3 to 5 people. We don't need people to, please don't listen to this and say like, oh my gosh, I got to like whack my C-suite in half. That's obviously not the point. And I wouldn't think that anyone would do that anyways. But I think the point is that you've rightly looked at it in more than just a quote headcount perspective, but also in a functional elements perspective. So thanks for that, Blaine. And why don't you bring us home on this episode?
Yeah, I think that wraps up the questions we had from our second Colorado Fire Leadership Series. Just want to say thanks to those folks again for your engagement, your participation. We're having a great time doing this. And for all of you out there, we hope you're getting some value out of this. If you've got questions for us, we want to hear them. We read every single one of them, and we'd love to get them on the show. So just send us a note to contact@appliedleadershippartners.com. We'll take a look at it. We'll do our best to address it, and we will see you again soon.